When I got home, my brother called, "Do you have a knife? We have to cut down Dad." Cut him down from what? I couldn't process what my brother Sammy was saying. "I'm in the basement, hurry up." His voice was pure panic. I sprinted through the front door and grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen drawer. My hands shook as I thundered down the basement stairs, taking them 3 at a time. What I saw at the bottom stopped me cold. Dad was suspended from the ceiling beam with rope around his wrists. His feet barely touched the ground, and a gag was stuffed in his mouth. Sammy was trying to untie the knots, but his fingers kept slipping. Dad's face was purple, and his eyes were bulging with fear. What happened? I rushed over with the knife. "I found him like this." Sammy held Dad's weight while I sawed at the rope. The knife was dull, and the rope was thick. Every second felt like an hour as I hacked away. Dad made muffled sounds through the gag, getting more frantic. Finally, the rope snapped, and he collapsed onto us. We lowered him to the ground, and I pulled the cloth from his mouth. "Your mother! They took your mother. We don't have much time left." Dad gasped for air between words. Sammy helped him sit up while I tried to make sense of what he was saying. Someone had tied up our father in our own basement. Someone had taken our mother. None of this felt real. We half-carried Dad up the stairs and to my car. He could barely walk and kept mumbling about Mom being in danger. Sammy drove while I sat in the back with Dad trying to get more information. He was too shaken to explain clearly. Just kept saying, "They took her," and we had to hurry. The police station was only 10 minutes away, but it felt like forever. Dad stumbled through the entrance and collapsed into a chair while Sammy explained to the desk officer. She called for detectives immediately when she saw Dad's wrists and heard the word kidnapping. 2 detectives took us to an interview room. Dad was more coherent now, but his story didn't make much sense. He'd come home from work early and found 2 men in our house. They'd jumped him before he could react, tied him up in the basement, made him watch on his phone as they drove away with Mom in her own car. "Can you track her phone?" Sammy asked desperately. The detectives tried, but her phone was off or destroyed. Without a location, they couldn't issue an Amber Alert or know where to send units. We were stuck in that room while Mom was out there somewhere with whoever had done this. That's when Sammy's face lit up with realization. "She took my car for work today. Mine has GPS tracking for insurance." He pulled out his phone and opened the tracking app with shaking fingers. The location showed an address across town, an empty parking lot by an old warehouse district. The detectives called for backup, but we were already heading for the door. "You need to let us handle this." One detective tried to stop us. Dad pushed past him with surprising strength for someone who'd just been tortured. We piled into my car and sped toward the warehouse. Sammy gave directions from his phone while Dad gripped the dashboard. The parking lot was empty except for Sammy's car parked at the far end. No other vehicles, no signs of people. We approached carefully, even though every instinct screamed at us to run. The windows were tinted, but we could see movement inside. Sammy yanked open the back door. Mom was there with her wrists zip-tied and duct tape over her mouth. Her eyes went wide with fear when she saw us. I cut the zip ties while Sammy pulled off the tape as gently as he could, and immediately our mom told us, "Where's your baby sister? None of you took your baby sister?" That's who they wanted. My stomach dropped like I'd been punched, and I grabbed the empty baby carrier from Mom's arms while Sammy helped her stand up properly. None of us had thought about the baby. She wasn't with Dad when we found him in the basement. She wasn't here with Mom. My hands started shaking worse than when I was cutting Dad down. Dad fumbled for his phone and started dialing our neighbor, Mrs. Lefebvre, who sometimes watched the baby when Mom needed a break. His fingers kept missing the numbers, and he had to start over twice. The rest of us stood there frozen in that empty parking lot waiting for the phone to ring. First ring, second ring, third ring. Mrs. Lefebvre picked up, and Dad put it on speaker with trembling hands. She said the baby was fine, playing with blocks in her living room, but then her voice got serious. Someone had come to her door about 2 hours ago, claiming we'd sent them to pick up the baby. A man she'd never seen before. He knew our names and the baby's name, but something felt wrong about the whole thing, so she told him to leave and lock the door. She'd tried calling Mom's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. We were already running back to my car before she finished talking. I drove this time while Sammy helped Mom into the passenger seat, and Dad climbed in back. The warehouse district was 20 minutes from the police station, but I made it in 12. My tires squealed into the parking lot and we burst through the doors. The same desk officer from before jumped up when she saw us. Sammy explained about the baby being the real target, while she grabbed her radio and called the detectives back from the warehouse. They hadn't even gotten there yet. Within 3 minutes, a different detective showed up, older with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. He started firing questions at us before we even sat down. Did we have custody disputes? Was the adoption contested? Did anyone else have a claim on the baby? Dad's face went white as paper. He looked at Mom, then at the floor. There had been complications during the adoption 6 months ago. The birth mother's ex-boyfriend had shown up at the hospital trying to stop everything. Security had to remove him. The detective's jaw tightened, and he led us to a bigger conference room. 2 more people showed up within minutes. A woman who specialized in child abduction cases, and another officer with a laptop. They set up what looked like a command center right there on the conference table. Maps spread out, phones charging, radios crackling. The specialist explained we needed to secure the baby immediately and figure out exactly who was behind this. 2 patrol officers arrived to escort us to Mrs. Lefebvre's house. We drove in a convoy with a police car in front and another behind us. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went numb. Mrs. Lefebvre had the baby ready at the door with her diaper bag packed. The officers checked her yard and garage before we went in. The baby reached for me when she saw us, completely unaware of what had happened. She grabbed my nose and laughed while I carried her to the car. The relief of holding her made my legs weak, but the thought of someone trying to take her made me want to throw up. Back at the station, the detective had us go through every detail of the adoption process. Where we got the lawyer, which agency we used, any weird phone calls or letters. Dad sat there sweating through his shirt. He finally admitted he'd gotten 3 angry voicemails last week. The caller said we'd stolen something that wasn't ours. Dad thought it was a wrong number or some prank, so he deleted them without telling anyone. Mom's face went red, and she started to say something, but the detective held up his hand. Right then, Mom's phone rang. The daycare. The director said someone had tried to pick up the baby yesterday afternoon. A man claiming to be her uncle. The worker at the front desk got suspicious because she knew we didn't have any brothers. She asked for ID, and the man left quickly. She was calling now because she just saw the news about a kidnapping in our neighborhood and wanted to check if we were okay. The detective took the phone and got all the details while we sat there processing how long this had been planned. These people had been watching us. They knew our routines. They knew where the baby went to daycare. They knew which neighbor watched her. 2 officers drove us to a hotel downtown while crime scene techs went to process our house. We couldn't go home until they cleared it. The baby rode with me in the back seat playing with her stuffed elephant, babbling nonsense words. At the hotel, they put us in connecting rooms on the 3rd floor. An officer stationed himself in the hallway. Mom and Dad were too rattled to take care of the baby properly, so she stayed in my room. I gave her a bath in the hotel sink and fed her mashed bananas from the room service menu. She fell asleep on my chest while I watched the door and listened for footsteps in the hallway. Around midnight, Dad knocked softly and came in. He sat on the edge of the bed and finally told me the whole story. The birth mother's ex-boyfriend was named Bowen Richards. He'd been fighting the adoption from day one, even though he had no legal rights. He claimed the birth mother was forced to give up the baby, said we'd paid her off, said the adoption lawyer was corrupt. None of it was true, but he wouldn't stop filing complaints and showing up at hearings. The birth mother had signed all the papers willingly, and we'd done everything by the book. But Bowen had convinced himself the baby belonged to him. The detective called at 6 in the morning while I was still holding the baby who'd barely slept. He said they found doorbell camera footage from our neighbor's house, showing a white van circling our street for 3 days straight. The partial plate they could make out matched a rental from the airport location. I handed the baby to Mom, who hadn't let go of her for more than 5 minutes since we got her back from the neighbor yesterday. Dad put the phone on speaker while the detective explained they were working with the rental company to get more information. We spent the next few hours in the hotel room going through every piece of adoption paperwork we had while waiting for updates. Mom kept the baby pressed against her chest the whole time, feeding her bottles with one hand while flipping through documents with the other. The detective called back around 10 with news from the rental company. Someone named Bowen Richards had rented the van 4 days ago, using an out-of-state license from Montana. The contact info he gave them led to a disconnected phone number and an address that turned out to be a vacant lot. Digital forensics had been going through Bowen's credit card records and found multiple purchases near the warehouse district over the past week. Gas stations, fast food places, a hardware store where he bought rope and zip ties. He'd been planning this for days and must have been watching us to learn our routines. The detective got a judge to sign emergency protective orders, but admitted they were basically useless pieces of paper without knowing where Bowen was right now. We were told to stay in the hotel indefinitely for our safety. Sammy had been on his laptop all morning and suddenly turned the screen toward us. He'd found Bowen posting in online forums about stolen babies and corrupt adoption agencies going back months. The posts started out asking for legal advice, but got angrier over time. The most recent ones from last week talked about taking matters into his own hands when the system failed him. Around noon, the detective called again, saying the daycare worker was at the station working with a sketch artist. She remembered the man who tried to pick up the baby had a distinctive tattoo on his neck that looked like a snake or dragon. She was also able to describe his clothes and the way he walked with a slight limp. We were eating room service lunch when Dad's phone rang from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but the detective had told us to pick up everything in case it was important. It was Bowen's voice on the other end, demanding we return his child, or things would get worse for us. The detective was still on Mom's phone and started recording while making hand signals for Dad to keep him talking. Dad's hands shook as he tried to sound calm and asked Bowen what he wanted. Bowen went on a rant about how we stole his daughter and the birth mother was forced to give her up. Dad kept trying to reason with him, but Bowen just got louder and more angry. After about 3 minutes, he hung up. The detective said they'd trace the call, but warned us it was probably a burner phone. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, he called back, saying the trace led to a disposable phone, but cell tower data put Bowen somewhere downtown. Police units flooded the area within minutes, but couldn't find him. He was clearly moving around and staying one step ahead of them. That night, everything boiled over when Mom finally lost it on Dad. She was furious he'd kept the threatening voicemails secret and hadn't told anyone about them. Her voice got loud enough to wake the baby, who started crying. Dad tried to explain he thought they were just pranks, but Mom wasn't having it. She kept saying he put all of us in danger by not taking the threats seriously. Their argument got so heated, I had to take the baby out to the hallway to calm her down. The officer stationed outside our door looked uncomfortable as I walked past him, bouncing the baby and making shushing sounds. We paced up and down the hallway for 20 minutes while my parents' muffled voices carried through the door. Other hotel guests poked their heads out to see what the noise was about. The baby finally settled down and fell asleep against my shoulder. When we went back inside, Mom and Dad were in separate corners of the room, not looking at each other. The tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Mom took the baby from me and went into the bathroom to give her a bath, while Dad sat on the bed with his head in his hands. Sammy and I just looked at each other, not knowing what to say. This whole thing was tearing our family apart, and Bowen was still out there somewhere planning who knows what. The detective had promised to call if there were any developments, but we hadn't heard anything in hours. I kept checking my phone, hoping for good news, but nothing came. We were stuck in this hotel room with no idea how long we'd have to stay or when we'd be safe to go home again. The baby was the only one who seemed okay, playing with her toy elephant and babbling like nothing was wrong. Watching her made me angry that someone wanted to rip her away from the only family she'd ever known. She'd been with us since she was 2 days old, and now some stranger thought he had the right to take her. Mom came out of the bathroom with the baby wrapped in a towel and started getting her ready for bed. Dad tried to help, but Mom pulled away from him. It was going to be a long night with all of us crammed in these 2 rooms, and my parents not speaking to each other. The next morning, Dad's phone rang while we were eating breakfast from the hotel vending machines, and it was the adoption attorney finally calling back after ignoring us for days. He sounded nervous and kept clearing his throat as he explained how he'd taken some shortcuts with the legal notifications to speed things up for us. He admitted he never properly notified Bowen because the guy wasn't married to the birth mother and seemed to have no legal standing anyway. Dad's face went red as the attorney kept making excuses about how these things usually work out fine and nobody ever challenges them. I could hear Mom muttering angry words from across the room while she changed the baby's diaper. The attorney promised to send over all the paperwork to prove the adoption was still valid, but Dad hung up on him mid-sentence. We were still processing this mess when Mom's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message had no words, just a photo of our house taken from the street that same morning with a timestamp showing it was less than an hour old. Despite having police supposedly watching our place, Bowen had gotten close enough to take pictures. The detective called within minutes because they were monitoring our phones and had seen the message come through. He said they were pulling the officers from our house immediately to sweep for any signs of Bowen, but found nothing except fresh footprints in the flower bed under our living room window. The detective made the call that we needed to move somewhere more secure than this hotel. Within 2 hours, we were packing our few belongings into black duffel bags while officers cleared the hallway. They loaded us into 3 different unmarked cars with tinted windows, splitting us up so nobody could follow all of us at once. I rode with Sammy and an officer while Mom and Dad took the baby in another car. The drive took us way out to the industrial part of town where nobody would think to look for a family. The safe house looked like any other rundown apartment building from the outside, with peeling paint and broken mailboxes. Inside, though, it had reinforced doors, security cameras in every room and bars on all the windows that could be opened from inside in case of emergency. We got 2 connected units on the 3rd floor with officers stationed in the hallway, and another team watching the building entrance. The place smelled like old carpet and cleaning products, but at least we were together again. Mom immediately started baby-proofing the sharp corners while Dad tested every lock twice. The next day, a social worker from CPS showed up with a thick folder and a checklist longer than my arm. She walked through every room taking photos and notes about where the baby would sleep and eat. She asked Mom about feeding schedules and doctor visits while checking the formula temperature and counting diapers. Then she interviewed each of us separately about the kidnapping and whether we felt the baby was safe with us. Sammy got frustrated when she asked him the same questions 3 different ways, like she was trying to catch him lying. Dad had to bite his tongue when she questioned why he hadn't reported the threats sooner. The whole thing took 4 hours, and felt like we were the ones being investigated instead of being victims. She finally said she'd recommend keeping the baby with us, but would need weekly check-ins until the situation was resolved. That afternoon, the detective came by with news about the second kidnapper. They'd lifted prints from our basement where Dad had been tied up and matched them to a guy with a long record for assault and robbery. His name was Jim Wells, and he'd done time with one of Bowen's cousins, which is probably how they connected. Police were watching his girlfriend's apartment and his mother's house, but he hadn't shown up at either place yet. The detective showed us photos of Wells so we'd recognize him if we saw him. He had a thick neck and a scar running through his left eyebrow that made him look mean even when he was trying to smile for his mugshot. 2 days into being stuck in the safe house, we were all getting on each other's nerves bad. The baby could sense the tension and cried more than usual, which made everyone more stressed. Sammy and I took turns walking her around the small living room, trying different songs and funny faces to calm her down. Mom and Dad spent hours on the phone with lawyers, trying to understand if Bowen could actually have any legal claim to the baby. The lawyers all said different things about biological father rights versus adoption procedures, but agreed Bowen had no case since he wasn't the biological father. That's when the detective got a call from another attorney saying the birth mother wanted to talk to us. She was scared of Bowen, but wanted to help stop him. Her attorney said she'd been hiding at her sister's house 2 states away since she heard about the kidnapping. She sent a recorded statement saying she'd chosen adoption completely on her own because she couldn't raise a baby at 17. She swore Bowen wasn't the father and that he'd become obsessed with the pregnancy, even though they'd broken up months before she got pregnant. She said he'd convinced himself the baby was his and started threatening her when she wouldn't let him sign the birth certificate. Her voice shook on the recording as she described how he'd shown up at the hospital when she was in labor and had to be removed by security. She apologized over and over for not warning us about him sooner, but she thought he'd given up when the adoption went through. The next morning brought good news for once. Security cameras from the warehouse district had been pulled and enhanced by the tech team. They had clear footage of Bowen and Wells loading rope and zip ties into a van the morning of the kidnapping. The license plate was visible and matched the rental van from the airport. Both of their faces were clearly shown, which meant arrest warrants could be issued immediately. The detective seemed confident they'd catch them within days, now that every cop in 3 states had their photos. He suggested setting up surveillance at the daycare since Bowen had already tried there once and might try again. Mom shut that down immediately, saying she wouldn't use the baby as bait under any circumstances. The detective tried explaining it would be completely safe with officers hidden everywhere, but Mom wouldn't budge. Dad surprisingly took her side, saying we'd been through enough without dangling the baby out there like fishing bait. The argument got heated with the detective insisting it was the fastest way to end this whole thing. Around midnight, the baby woke up burning hot with fever. Her forehead felt like a furnace, and she wouldn't stop crying no matter what we tried. The thermometer read 103 degrees, which meant we needed to get her to a hospital immediately. The officers called ahead to arrange a police escort, while Mom bundled the baby in a light blanket. 2 patrol cars led us through empty streets with their lights off to avoid attention. The emergency room was mostly empty at that hour, but every person who walked past made my heart race, wondering if they were watching us. A man in a baseball cap looked at us too long, and I grabbed Sammy's arm until the guy walked away to the vending machines. Every footstep behind us made me turn around, expecting to see Bowen or Wells coming for the baby. The nurse took the baby's temperature again and gave her medicine to bring down the fever while we waited in a curtained-off area. Security guards stood at both ends of the hall, but that didn't stop me from checking every face that passed by. About an hour later, one of the officers rushed in and whispered something to his partner, who immediately got on his radio. The detective showed up within minutes, looking worried, and pulled us into a private room while nurses watched the baby. He showed us grainy security footage on his phone of a man in the parking garage who matched Bowen's build and height walking between cars about 20 minutes after we'd arrived. By the time security got there, he was gone, but his van was caught on the exit cameras heading north. The baby's fever broke around dawn, and the doctor cleared us to leave, but the detective said we couldn't go back to the hotel anymore. They loaded us into unmarked cars and drove us 2 hours to a different city where they'd arranged rooms at a business hotel near the airport. The baby screamed the whole drive and wouldn't calm down no matter what we tried. She knew something was wrong with all this moving around, and her little routine was completely destroyed. We'd been at the new hotel for maybe 6 hours when the detective called with big news. Jim Wells got pulled over for speeding in another state and tried to run when the cop recognized him from the alert. They caught him at a truck stop trying to hitchhike, and he started talking immediately to save his own skin. The detective came to brief us in person that evening, and what Wells had told them made my stomach turn. According to him, Bowen was completely convinced the baby was his biological daughter, even though everyone, including the birth mother, said otherwise. He'd created this whole story in his head where we'd stolen his family and paid off the birth mother to lie about who the real father was. Wells said Bowen had notebooks full of fake evidence he'd created to prove his case and had been planning this for months before the adoption even went through. The detective asked if we'd be willing to have the birth mother make an official recorded statement to help build the case. Mom was hesitant at first, but Dad pointed out it might be the only way to prove Bowen had no claim. The birth mother's lawyer called the next morning, and we could hear her crying in the background as she gave her statement over speakerphone. She swore under oath that she'd only dated Bowen for 2 months, and they'd broken up long before she got pregnant with someone else entirely. Her voice shook as she described how Bowen had shown up at her school, her job, even the hospital when she was in labor, insisting the baby was his. She'd chosen adoption specifically to get away from him and thought moving to another state would end it. She apologized over and over for not warning the agency about him, but she'd been scared he'd find out where the baby went if she said anything. We were eating takeout in our room that night when Dad's phone rang from a blocked number. He almost didn't answer, but the detective had told him to in case it helped trace Bowen. The screaming started immediately with Bowen ranting about how we'd forced the birth mother to lie and he had proof she was threatened. Dad held the phone away from his ear while the detective's tech team tried to trace the call. Bowen went on for almost 10 minutes about his rights as a father and how we'd regret stealing his daughter before the line went dead. The trace led to a cheap motel 40 miles away, but by the time police got there, Bowen was long gone. What they found in his room made me sick. The walls were covered with printed photos of our family that he'd pulled from social media and public records. Pictures of our house, our cars, even one of me walking into a grocery store that I didn't know had been taken. Baby supplies were stacked in the corner like he'd been preparing to take her. The detective brought us photos of the room and pointed out how organized everything was, despite Bowen clearly losing touch with reality. He thought Bowen would make a desperate move soon since his plan was falling apart and Wells was in custody. They started putting undercover officers at the courthouse, the adoption agency, the hospital where the baby was born, anywhere connected to the case. We spent 3 more days in that hotel room going crazy from being cooped up. The baby was better but still fussy, and we were running out of ways to entertain her in such a small space. Sammy went to get more formula and diapers with an officer escort, while Mom and Dad argued quietly about what to do next. That's when the detective called saying Bowen had just tried to file emergency custody papers at the courthouse using forged documents claiming he was the biological father. Security recognized him from the alerts and moved to detain him, but he managed to slip away in a crowd of people leaving traffic court. The courthouse went into lockdown, but he was already gone. The detective came to see us that night looking exhausted and frustrated. 3 weeks of this chase had worn everyone down, and Bowen kept slipping through their fingers. He suggested something that made Mom immediately start shaking her head. A controlled meeting in a public place with heavy police presence, where Bowen could see the baby, and maybe they could end this peacefully. Mom absolutely refused, saying she wouldn't put the baby in danger for anything. Dad surprised me by speaking up and saying maybe it was worth considering if it meant ending this nightmare. The argument went on for hours with Mom getting more upset every time Dad brought up meeting with Bowen. She kept pacing the small hotel room while the baby slept in the portable crib the detective had brought us. I watched them go back and forth, Mom's hands shaking as she insisted we couldn't risk the baby's safety for anything. Dad kept saying we needed to end this before Bowen hurt someone else or found another way to get to us. The detective sat quietly in the corner, letting them work through it, while Sammy bounced his leg nervously on the other bed. Finally, the detective spoke up with an idea that made Mom stop pacing. What if we used a realistic baby doll instead of the real baby for the meeting, the kind they use for training classes that looks exactly like a real infant from a distance? Mom's face changed as she thought about it, and Dad immediately agreed this could work. The detective made some calls, and within 2 hours, someone delivered the most realistic fake baby I'd ever seen. It had weight to it, and soft skin that felt almost real when you touched it. We dressed it in the baby's clothes and put it in her carrier, while the real baby stayed safe at the police station with Sammy. The detective explained the plan while we practiced carrying the doll like it was our actual sister. The meeting would happen at the mall food court during the busiest time of day, with undercover officers positioned everywhere. Mom, Dad, and I would wear hidden microphones and cameras to record everything Bowen said or did. 2 days later, we drove to the mall in separate cars with officers following at a distance. My hands were sweating as I carried the fake baby in the carrier through the main entrance. Mom walked on my left and Dad on my right, both of them scanning the crowds for any sign of danger. The food court was packed with weekend shoppers and families eating lunch. We found a table in the middle where the officers could see us from all angles and sat down to wait. 20 minutes passed before Bowen appeared near the pizza place, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled and his hair stuck up in different directions. He spotted us immediately and started walking over with this desperate look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He stopped right in front of our table and stared at the carrier like he was seeing something holy. His hands reached out, but Dad stood up and blocked him from getting closer. Bowen's face turned red as he started yelling about his rights as a father and how we had no legal authority to keep his child from him. People at nearby tables turned to stare as his voice got louder and more angry. Mom pulled the carrier closer to her while I stood up next to Dad, ready to protect the doll like it was really my sister. Bowen kept screaming about corruption and stolen babies and how the whole system was against him. A mall security guard started walking over, but one of the undercover officers waved him off. That's when Bowen completely lost it and lunged across the table trying to grab the carrier from Mom's hands. Officers appeared from everywhere, coming out of stores and from behind pillars, surrounding him in seconds. Bowen fought hard, throwing punches and kicking as they tried to get him on the ground. He kept screaming about injustice and his stolen daughter while shoppers backed away in panic. It took 4 officers to finally get the cuffs on him while he thrashed around on the floor. I held the carrier against my chest, protecting it like the baby was really inside, while Mom cried from the stress of it all. They dragged Bowen out through the service entrance, still yelling about his rights and threatening to sue everyone involved. Back at the police station, we finally relaxed, knowing he was locked up and couldn't hurt us anymore. The detective warned us this was just the beginning, though, since Bowen would get his day in court. He'd have a lawyer and a chance to make his case, even though everyone knew it was completely baseless. We drove back to the safe house where Sammy was waiting with the real baby who'd been perfectly safe the whole time. She reached her little arms out for me when we walked in, and I'd never been happier to hold her. Sammy looked so relieved the plan had worked without anyone getting hurt. That night we actually slept well for the first time in weeks, knowing Bowen was behind bars. 3 days later we had to go to court for Bowen's bail hearing, which meant seeing him again. His public defender argued that his client just wanted to be heard about irregularities in the adoption process. The prosecutor laid out all the evidence of kidnapping, stalking, and assault, with photos of Dad's injuries and the motel room covered in our pictures. The judge took one look at everything and denied bail completely, saying Bowen was clearly a danger to our family. We found out later that the adoption attorney was facing his own problems for the shortcuts he'd taken with the paperwork. The state bar was investigating him for not following proper procedures, even though the adoption itself was still valid. The birth mother's consent was real and documented properly, so our adoption of the baby couldn't be challenged. It was frustrating that his sloppiness had caused all this trouble, but at least we knew the baby was legally ours. 2 weeks after Bowen's arrest, CPS showed up at the safe house to check on us. They said once we were cleared to go home, they'd need to do regular visits to make sure the baby was safe. The social worker walked through our house, making notes about locks on doors and windows we'd need to install. She asked about our plans for daycare and doctor visits, and how we'd keep the baby secure going forward. It was annoying having someone judge our parenting, but I understood they were just doing their job after everything that happened. The visits continued every week for the next 2 months, with different social workers checking on the baby's weight and development. Meanwhile, the legal cases moved forward with Bowen's accomplice taking a plea deal for 2 years in prison. He testified about how Bowen had hired him to help get his baby back and paid him $5,000 up front. The accomplice said Bowen was completely delusional about being the father and had shown him fake DNA tests he'd created on his computer. With all this evidence piling up, the prosecutor said Bowen would likely get at least 10 years for kidnapping, assault, and stalking charges. Mom brought up therapy at dinner the next night while the baby played with mashed carrots in her high chair. She said we needed help dealing with everything that happened, and especially the trust problems between her and Dad. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and he set it down slowly. He nodded without arguing, which surprised me since he usually hated talking about feelings. The therapist's office had toys scattered around and certificates on the walls. We sat on a brown couch while she asked us to describe what happened. Dad kept his arms crossed and barely spoke the first session. Mom did most of the talking while Sammy and I watched the baby crawl around the carpet. The second session got harder when the therapist asked Dad why he kept the threats secret. His face turned red, and he started explaining how he thought he could handle it himself. Mom's hands clenched in her lap as she listened. The therapist helped them talk without yelling at each other. After 4 sessions, we started actually communicating instead of just sitting there angry. 6 weeks after finding Dad in the basement, we sat in the courthouse for Bowen's sentencing. The prosecutor had worked out a deal, but the judge still needed to approve it. Bowen sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed. He looked smaller than I remembered from the mall. The judge read through all the charges while we waited: kidnapping, assault, stalking, attempted child abduction, and more. When she got to the sentence, 12 years, I felt Mom relax beside me. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order that would last even after prison. Bowen would never be allowed near our family again. He turned to look at us as the guards led him out. His eyes looked empty and lost. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the birth mother. Mom's hands shook as she opened it at the kitchen table. The letter apologized for everything Bowen put us through. She wrote that she never told him about the baby and didn't understand his obsession. She was glad the baby was safe with people who loved her. Mom read it 3 times before getting up to find a frame. She put it in the baby's memory box, along with her hospital bracelet and first photos. Sammy spent the next weekend installing cameras and alarms everywhere. He drilled holes in the walls and ran wires through the attic. Dad helped him mount the cameras while I held the ladder. By Sunday night, we had motion sensors on every door and window. The system sent alerts to all our phones if anything moved outside. It was definitely too much, but nobody complained. We all slept better, knowing we'd have warning if anyone approached the house. The daycare called to tell us their worker was getting an award. The police wanted to recognize her for stopping Bowen that first time. Without her suspicion, he might have taken the baby weeks earlier. We went to the ceremony at City Hall where the mayor shook her hand. She looked embarrassed by all the attention. We gave her flowers and a card, but it felt small compared to what she'd done. She hugged Mom and said she was just doing her job. 3 months passed and things started feeling normal again. The baby learned to crawl fast and got into everything. We had to put locks on all the cabinets after she found the cleaning supplies. She pulled herself up on furniture and took sideways steps while holding on. We stopped freezing every time someone knocked on the door. The pizza delivery guy didn't make us panic anymore. Even unexpected phone calls stopped making our hearts race. Life found its rhythm with bottles and naps and diaper changes. Dad surprised us by joining a support group at the community center. He went every Thursday night and came home looking tired but lighter somehow. One night, he told us about the other people in his group. Some had been robbed, others attacked, all trying to move forward. It was strange hearing him talk about feelings instead of sports or work. But it was good too, like he was becoming more real. The detective called every few weeks to check on us. He updated us on Bowen's situation in state prison. Apparently Bowen was in psychiatric treatment, which the detective said he clearly needed. The calls got shorter as months passed, and there was less to report. Bowen was serving his time without causing problems. The detective said that was the best outcome we could hope for. We planned a small party for the baby's first birthday. Just family and our closest friends in the backyard. Mom made a cake from scratch while Sammy hung streamers. The baby wore a pink dress that got covered in frosting within minutes. She grabbed handfuls of cake and smeared it everywhere. Her face was pure joy as she squished it between her fingers. Looking at her, it was hard to believe someone tried to steal her from us. Mom decided to go back to work when the baby turned 1. But first, she researched every daycare in town. She visited 6 different ones and grilled them about security procedures. The place she picked had cameras in every room and a locked entry system. She explained our whole situation to the director, who was incredibly understanding. They promised to be extra careful and never release the baby to anyone not on our list. The next week, Sammy signed us both up for self-defense classes at the community center without even asking me first. He just showed up with gym bags and told me we started that night. The instructor was this short woman who could flip guys twice her size like they weighed nothing. She made us practice the same moves over and over until our muscles remembered them without thinking. Sammy picked it up faster than me, but we both got pretty good at breaking holds and using someone's weight against them. After 6 weeks, we could actually spar without looking totally lost. Mom came to watch our test at the end and took videos of us throwing each other on the mats. 2 months later, we got called back to court for the adoption hearing. The judge wanted to review everything after what happened with Bowen. We sat in the courtroom for 3 hours while lawyers went through every single document. The judge asked Dad about the threats he got and why he didn't report them. She grilled the adoption attorney about his shortcuts until he was sweating through his suit. Mom held the baby the whole time and wouldn't let anyone else take her even when she got fussy. Finally, the judge stamped the papers and said the adoption was ironclad legal now. She gave us 5 certified copies and told us to keep them in different safe places. We put one in our bank deposit box, one at Mom's sister's house, one in Dad's office safe, one with our family lawyer, and one hidden in the house. Spring came, and Dad booked us a cabin by the lake for a long weekend. It was the first time we'd gone anywhere as a family since everything happened. The baby loved the water and kept trying to eat the sand. Sammy taught her to build sand castles, but she just knocked them down and laughed. Mom actually fell asleep on the beach chair while Dad read a book next to her. We grilled hot dogs and made s'mores at night while the baby played with her toys on a blanket. Nobody talked about what happened or looked over their shoulders constantly. On the drive home, Dad mentioned maybe doing foster care someday to help other kids. Mom shut that down fast, saying she just wanted to focus on our family for now. The baby took her first real steps a week after we got back from the lake. She'd been pulling herself up on furniture for months, but this time she let go and walked 3 whole steps to Sammy. He was sitting on the floor playing with her blocks when she just stood up and toddled right to him. Her first real word came the same day when she pointed at him and said, "Sammy," clear as anything. My brother actually got tears in his eyes and picked her up to spin her around. After that, she walked everywhere and got into everything we hadn't baby-proofed yet. She'd toddle from person to person, holding her arms up to get picked up. The detective called on the exact 1-year anniversary of finding Dad in the basement. He said he was officially closing our case file since Bowen was locked up and everything was resolved. We exchanged personal phone numbers, and he told us we were the kind of family that gave him hope about his job. He'd seen too many families fall apart after trauma, but we'd gotten stronger. That Saturday, I took the baby to the park, while Mom and Dad sat on a bench watching. Sammy had brought his skateboard and was teaching some neighborhood kids how to do kickflips. The baby loved the baby swings and would laugh every time I pushed her. Other families were there doing the same thing, and nobody would guess what we'd been through. We looked like any other family enjoying the weekend. Some mom asked me how old my daughter was, and I just said 15 months without correcting her. That night, Mom gave the baby her bath while I got her pajamas ready. When I picked her up to carry her to the crib, she grabbed my finger with her little hand and wouldn't let go. She looked up at me with these big eyes that trusted me completely. I sat in the rocking chair holding her until she fell asleep, still gripping my finger. Looking at her peaceful face with her thumb in her mouth made everything we went through worth it. Our family was different now, but we were together and safe. The baby would grow up never remembering any of the scary stuff. She'd just know she had parents and brothers who loved her and would do anything to protect her. Dad had started leaving work on time to be home for dinner. Mom didn't panic when the baby was out of sight for 2 seconds. Sammy and I didn't freeze up when someone knocked on the door anymore. We were finding our new normal one day at a time. Well, folks, that's it from me today. Thanks for sticking with me and letting me throw my thoughts and questions out there along the way. I really appreciate it. Like the video, it helps more than you think.